Beneath the bright CNN studio lights stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, her maroon suit reflecting quiet confidence as she prepared to face one of America's most formidable legal minds. From backstage, moments earlier, had stepped Alan Dershowitz, the 85-year-old Harvard law professor emeritus and renowned attorney, clutching a stack of papers, his expression firm with intent. "I've got the evidence that will expose the Congresswoman's lack of legal understanding," Dershowitz declared to the moderator, his voice steady with the authority of a man who had argued before the Supreme Court countless times. "She might be a rising star in our party, but tonight viewers will see she's far out of her depth." The audience stirred, phones raised to record what was sure to be a heated debate. With his decades of experience, Harvard pedigree, and high-profile clientele, Dershowitz appeared confident this would be an easy win over the relatively new Congresswoman, who had served in Congress for only 2 years. But Crockett didn't flinch. The former public defender and civil rights attorney stood poised, a faint, knowing smile on her face as her eyes met his. She had prepared for this confrontation in detail, and those who knew her recognized the look. This wasn't going to be an ordinary debate. It was about to become one of the most challenging moments in Dershowitz's long career. As CNN's cameras began rolling, the host introduced the segment on voting rights legislation. Neither Crockett nor Dershowitz looked away during their intense stare-down. The veteran legal scholar was about to learn that underestimating Jasmine Crockett would prove to be his biggest mistake on national television. Before diving into this remarkable exchange, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more insightful political debates and analysis. You'll want to see every second of how Congresswoman Crockett turned the tables on one of America's most celebrated attorneys. The CNN studio buzzed with anticipation as host Rebecca Mitchell opened the discussion. Tonight we're joined by 2 legal experts to debate the Voting Rights Protection Act currently before Congress. Harvard law professor emeritus Alan Dershowitz, who has argued before the Supreme Court and represented several high-profile clients, and Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a former public defender and civil rights lawyer now serving her first term in the U.S. House. Dershowitz sat upright, his silver hair neatly combed, dressed in a crisp navy suit that exuded establishment prestige. At 85, he carried the weight of decades in academia, having influenced generations of lawyers and defended clients from O.J. Simpson to Jeffrey Epstein. His expression was firm. He had not come to discuss, but to dominate. "Thank you for having me, Rebecca," he began, his Boston accent still noticeable. "I've been teaching constitutional law since before the Congresswoman was born. I think the public deserves to hear from someone who actually understands the legal complexities involved." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. He shuffled his papers, highlighting sections of the bill and previous court rulings, props meant to underline his authority. Across the table, Crockett sat composed in her maroon suit, a gold necklace catching the studio light. At 43, the Yale-educated attorney had built her reputation differently, not through elite circles, but by defending everyday Americans before entering politics and later winning her congressional seat. Her calm expression concealed the sharp legal mind that had won her numerous courtroom battles against opponents who underestimated her. "Good evening," Crockett said evenly, her voice carrying a trace of her Texas roots. "Unlike some, I'm not here to lecture Americans from an ivory tower. I'm here to talk about legislation that impacts real voters, people I've represented both in court and now in Congress." Rebecca Mitchell nodded, sensing the growing tension. "Let's begin with the basics. Professor Dershowitz, you've called this bill an unconstitutional overreach. Congresswoman Crockett, you're one of its co-sponsors. What's at stake here?" Before Crockett could respond, Dershowitz leaned forward. "What's at stake is nothing less than the constitutional balance of power. The Congresswoman and her colleagues want federal control over what the Constitution clearly reserves for the states. This isn't just poor policy, it's unconstitutional. I'm surprised anyone with a law degree would support it." The camera caught Crockett's faint smile, not amusement, but recognition. She had faced countless prosecutors and opposing counsel who used similar tactics, dismissive, condescending, and eager to undermine her expertise. Behind the scenes, her team had prepared thoroughly for this very approach, analyzing Dershowitz's debate style, his tendency to interrupt, assert intellectual superiority, and sidestep opposing arguments instead of engaging directly. What Dershowitz didn't realize was that Crockett had spent her weekend reviewing his past writings, not just recent comments on voting rights, but also essays from the 1970s and 1980s that directly contradicted his current position. She even spoke to 3 of his former Harvard students who offered valuable insights into his argumentative habits and weaknesses. Meanwhile, in the control room, CNN producers watched closely. The segment had been framed as a substantive policy discussion, but the personal tension between the 2 lawyers was creating far more compelling television. The network's social media team began uploading clips of Dershowitz's opening remarks, anticipating that the exchange was about to go viral. The stakes extended beyond the Voting Rights Protection Act. For Dershowitz, it was about preserving his legacy as one of America's most prominent legal minds in his later years. For Crockett, it was about proving that a new generation of lawyers, diverse, grounded in community experience, and fearless in the face of establishment power, deserved to be heard as equals in shaping the nation's legal future. Rebecca turned to Crockett. "Congresswoman, your response to the professor's constitutional concerns." Crockett straightened her papers, her expression shifting from polite to focused. "I'd be glad to address those constitutional points, Rebecca, but first, viewers should understand something essential about this discussion." Her voice was firm and clear as she continued. "What people need to realize is that interpreting the Constitution isn't reserved for Ivy League professors. It belongs to every American, especially those most affected by its interpretation." Dershowitz raised an eyebrow, opening his mouth to interrupt, but Crockett kept going. "The professor implies I misunderstand constitutional law. Let's address that. Article 1, Section 4 clearly grants Congress authority over federal elections. The 14th and 15th Amendments further empower Congress to safeguard voting rights. This isn't advanced theory, it's written law." Dershowitz shook his head, visibly irritated. "Congresswoman, I'm fully aware of those provisions, but the Supreme Court has repeatedly affirmed state authority in election administration, notably in Shelby County versus Holder." "I'm familiar with Shelby County," Crockett replied, having litigated voting rights cases directly impacted by it. "The question isn't whether states have authority, it's whether that authority can be used to silence voters." The professor's face tightened. "That's precisely the kind of emotional argument that clouds this debate. The Constitution guarantees equal protection, not voting convenience." "When voting restrictions disproportionately affect certain communities," Crockett countered, "that's not about convenience, it's about constitutionality." Rebecca interjected. "Let's focus on specific sections of the bill. Professor, you've criticized the requirement for minimum early voting days. Why?" Dershowitz leaned forward. "This is where Congress oversteps. States differ in population and resources. A uniform federal rule ignores these realities and violates federalism. I have statements from election officials in 17 states warning these mandates would cause logistical chaos. The Congresswoman is pushing ideology over practicality." Crockett waited patiently, then responded. "Interesting you mention election administrators. I have statements from 23 states, including Republicans, supporting these standards as both achievable and essential." She turned directly to Dershowitz. "Let's talk consistency. Professor, in your 1982 book, Rights of the People, you wrote that federal voting standards may be necessary when states show ongoing discrimination or failure. You specifically endorsed national early voting standards. Has the Constitution changed or just your stance?" The camera caught Dershowitz's brief surprise. He hadn't expected her to quote his past work. Shuffling papers, he replied, "Academic thought evolves with evidence. The voting landscape has changed since the 1980s. My earlier position reflected concerns about specific states at that time." So constitutional principles shift with political climates? Crockett asked. Interesting for someone claiming to be an originalist. The tension rose as Rebecca pivoted. Let's discuss voter ID laws. Critics say your bill weakens election integrity. Those critics ignore evidence, Crockett replied. Multiple studies, including from the Brennan Center, show voter impersonation fraud is nearly non-existent. What's real is that about 25 million Americans lack the required IDs. Dershowitz scoffed. The Brennan Center isn't impartial, and suggesting millions can't get IDs insults voters' intelligence. Crockett's tone hardened slightly. Professor, have you represented anyone who lost their vote because they couldn't afford ID documents? I have. I have met elderly citizens without birth certificates. I have spoken to low-wage workers unable to visit ID offices open only during work hours. I have. Calling these real barriers insults shows exactly the ivory tower problem I mentioned earlier. Sensing he was losing ground, Dershowitz shifted tactics. Your anecdotes don't override state authority to protect election integrity. The Supreme Court